Hello there, power of positivity. My name is Bart Coppens and I promote butterfly and moth conservation online. Not just that, I'm somebody who studies and documents the life cycles of butterflies and moths. And my job is to breed them in captivity. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about myself because the power of positivity has provided me some questions which I will gladly answer for you. Let's check them out. It looks like I have seven questions. Let's start with question number 1. Can you tell us more about yourself and what is your background? Okay, let's get started. My name is Bart Coppens. I live in the Netherlands, a tiny country in Northern Europe. I'm 29 years old and I've been obsessed with butterflies and moths since I was practically a toddler. Even when I was a baby, I was already pointing my finger at like ladybugs and other insects before I could learn to speak. So if people ask me, why are you so interested in butterflies and moths? I can come up with many reasons, but the truth is it doesn't really feel like a choice to me. It feels like something that I was born with. It was a very strong preoccupation of mine. It is something that my brain is generally so obsessed with that I can't help but spending most of my free time thinking about them. Even if I don't want to think about them, I still think about them. It's a unique obsession. I can give you some other reasons why I think they are fascinating though. First of all, I think their diversity, in particular the diversity of shapes and colors that they have, is breathtaking. There's 215,000 species of Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera is basically the butterflies and moths. You can spend a lifetime looking at them and you'll never be satisfied, or there is more to see than you could ever see in one single lifetime. And that appeals to me because it never gets old, you know? You can wake up every day and check out new species that you've never heard of before and learn something new. I think I'll never get to the point where I know everything about every species. That's simply impossible because it's too diverse. I think they're beautiful as well. Maybe beauty is a little bit superficial, but hey, I think it plays a role. It helps that they have magnificent shapes and colors. And I also noticed that, especially in the tropical areas of the world, many species are very poorly documented, very poorly studied. They get almost no attention, and that's a shame, because they are insects, and insects are some of the most important terrestrial animals when it comes to their crucial role in any ecosystem. Moths and butterflies in particular are very important food sources for bats. A lot of bats actually prefer to eat moths over many other insects if they can. Of course, it varies per species, but birds feed their chicks with caterpillars. So butterflies and moths alone, even though maybe it sounds crude to say that their function is being eaten by other animals, that's just the truth. They are a very important link in the food chain between plants and insectivores, basically. Butterflies and moths are herbivores, and they have very intricate relationships with plants, not only as herbivores, but sometimes also as pollinators. Did you know that there are certain species of orchids, for example, that are exclusively pollinated by certain species of moths? That's interesting, right? That's just a few examples of the fact that they are important. They are bioindicators. That means that the presence of certain species in the environment means the environment could be doing well, or it's doing badly. They can be an indicator of change in a certain ecosystem or habitat. On top of that, I think that they are really complex animals. We tend to think of insects as simple, but they are not simple. The way they communicate, their colors, for example, the way that their scales on the wings only refract certain wavelengths back to the observer while absorbing all the other wavelengths. And in some cases they even go as far as polarizing the light, as to give a polarized light signal to their peers, to other members of their own species. Stuff like that. is actually very complex stuff. Insects are not simple. They are complex, they are misunderstood, and they are important. And that is why I like them. And also because I'm just obsessed. That is my answer to question number 1. Let's see what the other questions are. For a moment. If there's an awkward silence here, you'll have to edit it out. Let's see. Question number 2. When did you start breeding butterflies and moths? Well, I pretty much started when I was 10 years old. I remember my parents allowed me to grow some cabbage in the garden, and some butterflies came, cabbage whites, came and laid eggs on the cabbage. And me as a child, I instinctively took the caterpillars and raised them in a tiny plastic box, and they turned into butterflies. Seeing that up close was really fascinating for me, just to see that metamorphosis in captivity of how such a funny little worm can turn into a beautiful butterfly. It's the closest thing that we have to magic, in my opinion. It's the fact that something can completely change its appearance and just grow to beautiful wings. It's fascinating. So yeah. The answer to the question is since I was a child, essentially. Let's go to the next question then. Why moths and butterflies as opposed to other insects? So why did I choose butterflies and moths in particular opposed to other insects? Well, the thing is, insects are so incredibly diverse. There's over 1 million of described species of insects. And the truth is, the subject itself is too large to study. I believe that if you want to achieve something in your life, you need to specialize yourself a little bit. Just look at some of the best doctors in the world, right? They are neurologists. They are people who basically specialize in the nerve system. Or they are cardiologists. They are somebody who specializes in the heart and veins. So you can be a urologist, you specialize yourself in the bladder, or whatever. For the same reason, doctors are specialized. As a biologist, you also want to be specialized, because if you want to make a contribution about a certain subject, you need to invest basically your time and effort into one subject and try to become as good at this as you can. I like all insects. I don't just like only butterflies and moths. I like all insects really, but I realized that, I also want to contribute knowledge, and in order to do that, I can't just generally study insects really. That's impossible. You need to choose a specialization, in my opinion. Especially when it comes to a subject that's that large, with literally millions of described species. It's impossible to study everything. Of course, there's entomologists who study insects in general, but when they do, they're often specialized in something else, such as the legs of insects, or the antennae of insects, or the pheromone communication of insects. But rarely everything about all insects in general. That rarely exists. It's too much. And of course, I guess it's just a metamorphosis that really appeals to me as well. So it's a combination of me wanting to specialize in something, and intuitively, butterflies and moths, I don't know, they just appeal the most to me, so I chose them. Next question. Question number 4 is, what are my daily activities around them? What are my daily activities around butterflies and moths? Well, if I'm breeding a lot of species, which is usually every year, the most work is feeding the caterpillars. So I have to go out every few days with, I have like these large pruning shears, and I go into the forest and I collect leaves of many types of plants. Funny thing is, each species of butterfly or moth are specialized in eating one particular kind of plant, really. So the funny thing is, I basically have like a shopping list, like a grocery list. Like I need oak tree for my oak hawk moths, for example. I need willow for another species of moth. You can go on. Basically, I have a whole list of plants that I need to pick every few days, because some species of caterpillars would rather starve than eat one single bite out of a leaf of a plant that they don't recognize. You know, for example, cabbage white butterflies, their caterpillars will only eat cabbage or plants from the cabbage family. The oleander hawk moth, their caterpillars will only feed on oleander or other plants that are related to oleander. It's a bit of a generalization, but to give you an idea, they're specialist herbivores. And for each species I raise, I usually need to find a unique arrangement of plants that they like. And that's the main activity. The adults, they don't take that much time. Many of the moths I raise only live for a few days. All they do is they mate and then they die. It's a bit crude, but the caterpillar stage is really the most demanding. I also spend a lot of time writing and editing. I'm also a writer and obsessive documenter, plus I'm a YouTuber. I make YouTube videos about butterflies and moths. Check out my YouTube channel if you haven't seen it yet. I film them, and I also spend a lot of time writing and editing, preparing articles. So, since recently I'm even traveling the world, since I'm sponsored by a natural reserve, I'm going to study the life cycles of butterflies and moths in the rainforest of Brazil soon. And there we will build a breeding space. It's basically like a small laboratory to rear native species, especially species that are poorly understood or understudied. And when I raise them in captivity, it will help their conservation, because I document the life cycle and what they eat. And this will help us protect these species in the future. But yeah, my daily routine is collecting a lot of leaves, making a lot of pictures, making a lot of videos, writing, editing, a combination of that stuff. Next question. Let's see. All right. The questions here on my phone. The next question is, how long is the process from egg to caterpillar to butterfly or moth? That's a difficult to answer question, because it really can't be generalized. Some of the fastest species that I ever raised, they went from an egg to a butterfly in about 3 weeks. That's very fast. Like literally from being laid as eggs to a fully fledged butterfly in just 3 weeks. It's possible. But in some cases, there are species that take years to grow. For example, in Europe you have the goat moth. Cossus cossus is the scientific name, the goat moth. And its caterpillars are wood boring. So they live inside trees and they feed on the wood. Now wood is pretty hard to break down and digest. It mainly consists of cellulose and lignin. These are very tough to break down. So the caterpillar takes 1 to 2 years, I think in the wild even up to 3 years, to develop from egg into a moth. But it also commonly happens that some species, they want to hibernate when they turn into cocoons, for example. They have what's called a diapause. And there's a lot of species of butterflies and moths that only have 1 generation a year. And you have to hibernate the cocoons before you're gonna see any moths whatsoever. So I do commonly raise species that take over a year to raise. If you are curious, you can see that on my YouTube channel as well, how I hibernate them, how long it takes. But yeah, it varies a lot per species. It can go very fast in a matter of weeks, and it can be months or years in some extreme cases. So there's a lot of variation, and that depends on the biology of the species. Next question. The next question is, what happens to butterflies and moths in winter? What is essential for their survival? Okay, so what happens to butterflies and moths outside in winter? Well, for the species to survive, they have to survive winter somehow. And most species have one dedicated life stage in which they can overwinter. For most species, this is the cocoon. I would say that the majority of species of butterflies and moths can hibernate in the pupal stage. And some species do this by spinning a silk cocoon that's quite tough, but also keeps them warm. They can even spin cocoons in leaf litter on the ground, which gives them some semblance of protection from the cold. Some caterpillars go as far as burrowing very deep underground, where they are protected from frost when they pupate underground. And when they emerge as a moth, the moths they climb up from the soil and they emerge. So the pupa of butterflies and moths can be very cold resistant, but it's not always the pupa. A number of species can hibernate as larvae or eggs, or even as fully fledged butterflies and moths. It's more rare that butterflies and moths themselves, like as an adult, can survive the winter, but some species do it. For example, in Europe, where I live, we have the brimstone butterfly. It's Goniopteryx rhamni is the scientific name. And that butterfly, it has antifreeze in its blood. It's called glycerol. It's a sugar alcohol. And this substance is basically in the blood, in the body fluid of the butterfly. I shouldn't say blood, it's hemolymph, but it's like a parallel thing to blood. But basically they have antifreeze glycerol in their body fluid, and this prevents them from freezing to death in winter. And this butterfly, when it becomes cold, it can just sit still in the vegetation in a secluded area. And it can survive the harsh frost. When it becomes warm again in spring, they become active and they start flying again. So some butterflies can literally... Think of the monarch butterfly, that's a famous example. You've probably seen the monarch butterflies overwintering in Mexico, right? So some butterflies can just overwinter like that. Others do it as cocoons. There's even some caterpillars who can hibernate. Usually those species, they are very furry, they have a lot of hair to keep them warm in winter. Or they burrow underground, or they hide very deeply in tree bark to escape from the frost. But yeah, I'd say as cold-blooded animals they can be quite cold resistant. Because when the temperature becomes cold, they don't really use any energy, right? They need external heat, external warmth, because they're cold-blooded, to activate their metabolism. So when temperatures are low, cold-blooded animals are also at a disadvantage, because it's hard for them to move if it's cold. It's hard for them to warm up to a point where they can move. But it's also an advantage when it comes to hibernation, because it means their energy expenditure is very low, because they're cold-blooded. So it's a double-edged blade, I would suppose. But I think when it comes to hibernation, it's in some ways an advantage. Next question. What advice do you give our audience? Oh, that's a good question. I have some advice for the audience of Power of Positivity, especially if you are interested in butterflies and moths. And that's that you can make a difference. You don't need to be a biologist. You don't have to have a degree. If you learn about insects, you can discover new things yourself, and you can make a difference. The cool thing about insects is such a big subject, and so many things are so poorly understood and so poorly recorded that you, as a complete amateur, can still go out in the wild and make new observations. It's absolutely possible. In many countries, in particular in tropical countries, but also just in the United States, for example, there's plenty of species of insects. They can be butterflies, moths, praying mantis, stick insects, but even stuff like flies, tiny beetles, that we don't really know much about. And all it takes is one person to observe them properly, write it down, document it, make a video, write a blog, do something with the information. If you document insects yourself, you're going to make a difference. It's not only scientists who should be doing it, it's you. You can plant flowers in your garden, you can attract insects, but what's important is make notes, make observations, make photographs, write a report, even try to raise some insects in captivity, if it's legal, okay? Make sure that species is not protected before you try to breed them in captivity, because that's not allowed. But in the majority of cases, insects don't have that much protection, which is a good thing, but also a bad thing. It's a good thing if you're an amateur looking to discover something new, but please people, if everybody in the world tried to raise some insects or study them or make one observation in their own backyard and they posted it online, then millions of people would be contributing new information that we can use. Really. And I found that the science of entomology depends a lot on amateurs. They make a huge difference. People who observe moths in their garden, who photograph butterflies outdoors, and put their observations on websites such as iNaturalist, it makes such a big difference. Some records of some of the world's rarest species come from amateurs, and without them we wouldn't even have pictures of the said species. So that's the biggest advice that I would give. Immerse yourself in it. Immerse yourself in the subject. Then you're going to make a difference. This is Bart Coppens, thanks for inviting me, and maybe until next time, or not, hope you enjoyed learning about what I do. Bye guys!